In a new age of watchmen, a team of individuals, pooling their talents and abilities, come together to bring analysis, reaction, and comedy to the fold. This is their chronicle. This is Accounting Arc.
All right. Hey, welcome everyone. I am particularly excited for this episode of Accounting Arc because I have two very non-traditional accountants with me today, and we're actually going to share with you some of what I think of as the bleeding edge of accounting. Let's start with having them introduce themselves. So can you really quickly, and maybe Ingrid first, can you introduce yourself, your firm, and what you kind of do as your day job?
My day job. Ooh.
Your day job.
Okay. Ingrid Edstrom, she, her pronouns, and I am calling in from the unceded ancestral lands of the Shasta and Takelma peoples in Southern Oregon. And my firm, if we can call it that at this point, is Priestess of Profits. I actually have stepped away from doing the back-end accounting work to focusing more on business strategy, consulting, and coaching, primarily with accounting professionals and primarily around how to shift our limiting beliefs that we've been indoctrinated into by these crazy capitalism, colonialism machine that we are finding ourselves in, and what we can do to live our values through the work that we're doing as accounting professionals. Though I often say, when people ask me what my day job is, I'm like, oh, I no longer work for a living. I just show up in my highest self in service, whether I'm getting paid for it or not. And I trust that the universe will ensure that I can continue to do so. So, yeah.
That's definitely a non-accounting viewpoint on it. I want to call a couple of things out of from what you said, or maybe actually one major thing with what you said, which is you're actually not doing the accounting yourself, but you are helping accountants or people in an accounting role to actually look beyond the traditional accounting and economics. And really, we'll get more into regenerative and what that means and all of that. But thank you. I just want to make sure people understood, like, this is not a traditional accounting in that sense. Also doing non-traditional accounting in a lot of ways is Matthew. So Matthew.
Yeah. Good day, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it might be. So my name is Matthew Heggem. I am the CEO and founder of 10kcreators.com. He, him pronouns. I'm tuned in from Custer, Washington, which is in the Pacific Northwest, on the lands of what was the Coast Salish people. They still are present in this community in different ways. The work that I do at 10K Creators is as a social enterprise. I consider myself, I would say, sort of in the accounting industry, but not in a traditional sense, because I do deal with numbers, but I go at it from the lens of serving a community that has traditionally been under-resourced. So what I do specifically is work with artists and arts organizations, helping them to answer the question of how do we improve how you make and manage money, right? It is more of a holistic approach. So for example, with my business clients, usually nonprofit arts organizations, we're having conversations, yes, about how their record keeping is happening, what improvements need to be made to their QuickBooks file, what spreadsheets they're using to manage their cash flow. But as we talk about those things, we're also talking about the employee's relationship to money and perhaps even trauma around money that they have, building up the facility of the organization to be able to have different kinds of conversations around equity, around compensation, and really kind of unpacking some of the harm that's been caused by capitalism to basically have more effective conversations around money decisions inside of an organization. So yeah, so I do end up in QuickBooks files. I'm not the one personally that will end up making changes for them, but for example, tomorrow I have a meeting with one of my clients, bookkeepers and tax accountants, to talk about the changes that need to happen in the financial statements, so that when we run the reports, they're the reports that we need to hand to the staff to then have these conversations about equitable compensation, for example. So yeah, that's the work I do.
I like that. I like that. And again, I think just listening to your description, people are probably going to hear this is definitely not kind of your traditional accounting role. A lot of it, I'm going to use the word corporate governance, comes back to kind of corporate governance and strategy, financial strategy. So if they need to, they can kind of put it there, but it's not quite that either, which I know we'll uncover a bit. Now, one word that you use that I would like you to help us understand a little bit more is social enterprise. I think I heard you say.
Yeah.
What does that What does that really mean?
So social enterprise, what that means to me is basically, in short, I am not a nonprofit organization, but I have a social mission, and it's to solve a problem. So the social mission of 10K Creators is to help 10,000 creatives find their path towards financial wellness. Right. So it's a business. There's a business model. I do all the things that every other business does, from developing a business strategy, marketing, sales, operations. It's my own bookkeeping and accounting, but I do it all under the lens of trying to create change inside of the communities that I serve, and do it maybe in ways that are a little bit non-traditional, right? For example, one of the things I did recently with a client of mine was we ran a financial empowerment program where we looked at the intersection of racial equity, financial empowerment, and the arts, right? So it's kind of coming at the work from maybe a different lens or perspective around changing conversations and doing good in the world. So
I like that you use the word holistic, and I think that's one we don't hear used very often. I think we hear it in medicine, holistic medicine, but we don't hear that often in our area in accounting. And a big piece of what you guys are doing, I think, is creating this holistic lens, or tools that we can use as we do this holistic lens through the Accounting Alchemy Network. And so can one of you or either of you jump in? What is the Accounting Alchemy Network, and what does it do?
Sure, I'll kick the ball, and then Ingrid, you can take it from there. Because I know Ingrid's going to answer some of your other questions in greater depth later. Anyway, so the Accounting Alchemy Network, what is it that we do? Well, Ingrid and I got together a couple of years ago, and we're old friends from the accounting industry. We've been sort of working in this space for I don't know how long, but for me, 15 plus years. And we ran into each other. We were like soulmates, aligned on a lot of different on a lot of different topics. And anyways, we got together at one point and we're like, okay. And she tells the story much better than I do, but the gist of it was like, hey, how do we make big change in the accounting industry? And we started talking about it. And well, it's like, okay, part of it was about community building, part of it was about education. And so we kind of brought our brains together on that topic. And fast forward, we co-founded the Accounting Alchemy Network. And what the Accounting Alchemy Network is a grassroots movement empowering accountants to act as agents for positive social and climate transformation, right? So we're educating accounting professionals and sometimes introducing them to ideas like ESG reporting, right? Environmental social governance reporting, or helping them to think about how, for example, inside of their organization, they can begin to create more equity, right? For example, in pay structures around gender, and even understanding what those dynamics look like inside of a quote traditional CPA firm, for example. And for us, it's there's plenty of resources out there about technology adoption and solving some of the challenges that we're facing as an industry from that lens. But there's very much a part of the work about solving some problems that we haven't yet solved on the people side of the equation. For example, like the impact that we have on our communities and the environment and other people. And so part of it is community building, education. We host lyceums where we bring people to the table to ask questions and maybe sit at an intersection that might feel a little bit different, right? For example, we've had people come in and talk about money and capitalism and trauma and how those things inform the dialogue that you might have with your client about their financial decision making. So yeah, so we're trying to hold the space for these types of conversations, and do it in a way that invites others to step forward as leaders in the industry to cause change as well. So that's sort of my today back of the napkin explanation. Ingrid, do you want to add more, or
One quick one before
Yeah.
Ingrid jumps into that. You used the word lyceum. Tell us what a lyceum is.
Oh gosh, Ingrid, can you answer that one? I don't want to be historically inaccurate on the reference point.
Lyceum was the venue where Socrates and Plato used to get together with their compatriots to discuss, philosophize, even debate and argue as a form of education. So we use that term to name our gatherings where we're doing similar things, to remind us that disagreement is welcome. How can we disagree kindly? How can we bring back a bit of that Socratic process of appreciative inquiry to use our diversity of ideas and opinions as starting places for learning, recognizing that we're going to come up with solutions together that no one of us would ever come up with alone, so long as we are celebrating the differences, that the diversity in the room needs to be seen as our biggest asset.
That makes a lot of sense. And I like that you're bringing in the ability to disagree, because I think that's what's missing so much in today's conversations. I mean, you hear the left and the right, the Republicans, the Democrats, like it's these extremes and no one's listening to each other or anybody that's in the middle.
Yeah.
Did you have anything else to add to Matthew's kind of what
I
Accounting
think a
Alchemy Network
really,
is?
really good example of one of my favorite lyceums is the one that we did with you, Donny. We had Donny Shimamoto and Donny McClurkin on to talk about what ESG would look like in a post-capitalist or post-growth kind of world, and if it's serving or not. And you're coming at it from the kind of more accounting ESG education perspective. Donny McClurkin, who's the executive director of the Post-Growth Institute, is coming at it from a full circle well-being economy. What does that look like perspective? And I remember it was one of our very first lyceums. And before we started the conversation, each of you was like, oh my goodness, what happens if we don't agree? And we're like, then we trust you to disagree in a curious, effective way. And by the end of the conversation, you were both like, oh my gosh, this was amazing. When can we do it again? And I feel like that's how most of our conversations go, is it just cultivates mind-blowing epiphanies for everybody involved.
Having participated in more than a handful, I totally agree with you, which is why I continue to participate. And I wanted to bring you guys onto the podcast because this is so innovative and different, but yet its roots are all the way back in history, like you said, back to Socrates, which I also always love. People don't realize too, I think that accounting goes all the way back, right? Way back in history as well. Tell us a little bit more about what the Accounting Alchemy Network is doing. And I think you've got your pillars of regenerative accounting. Maybe if you want to go start there.
Sure. So I think the easiest thing to just toss out there, we'll do a little bit of transparent facilitation here. None of us knows what we're doing. At one point, when I was just starting to speak at accounting conferences, and they were tossing awards at me like top 40 under 40 and most powerful women in accounting, and I'm like, oh my gosh, imposter syndrome is a thing. Because, hey, those of you watching this webinar, I am not a CPA. I'm a self-educated QuickBooks Pro advisor who learned how to do all of this on my own. And the first time somebody called me a quote unquote thought leader in the accounting profession, I just about hit the floor. I was like, oh no, what if they find out that I am not a CPA? I have no idea what I'm doing and I'm making all of this up as I go. They're going to think I'm a total fraud. And then I realized, wait a second, thought leaders are the ones making stuff up. That's what makes them thought leaders. And there's no limit to the number of thought leaders that can be in a room. What if we had more thought leaders? And now I coach accountants on how to get past their imposter syndrome and step into being the change they want to see in the world. So all of this stuff that we're doing in the Accounting Alchemy Network is extremely experimental, and we are making it up as we go. Like you said, Donny, it's kind of the bleeding edge. And to hear that from you, who's, a very well-known educator creating amazing curriculum in the accounting profession, to hear that we're kind of bleeding edge is like, oh, wow, hey, there's that imposter syndrome again. And I can push myself. We can do this thing. We were just on a lyceum earlier today talking about what it's like to live in the uncomfortable and to be in our stretch zone. And those are the kinds of environments that we're working to cultivate, recognizing that a lot of the systems that our world is currently using to function, and particularly the systems that the accounting profession was built upon, are not sustainable. There are things going on that are creating harm in our daily lives. The simple fact that accountants have been shown for decades to, hey, time to work 80+ hour weeks during tax season and not see your family for 3 months and sacrifice your overall health and well-being and all these other things to make the money and gain the credibility so that someday you can maybe reach this idea of partner within a firm. Who wrote that recipe, that timeline, that agenda for success? Is that our idea of success? Is that what success means to each of us? Because that doesn't sound fulfilling to me. And so as we start to question some of those limiting beliefs, we can look at where did some of these things come from? And when we begin to unpack them, we can see where a lot of these habits, traditions, just the way that the industry is currently operating are built upon many of the attitudes and behaviors of systems like institutionalized and systemic racism, settler colonialism, and capitalism, which the three put together are kind of a triad of unsustainable harm in our overall culture that is going back quite a ways now, that there are things that we can do to shift that. But we've been programmed to believe that that's just the way it is, and we need to just deal with it. And in order to survive, we have to stay on the hamster wheel and just make the money to buy the things that we want and be consumers in this world. We are starting to question those beliefs. We are starting to push that and say, okay, so if Buckminster Fuller basically said that we can't change a system by fighting against the existing system, we have to create a new modality that replaces the old system. That's what we're looking to do, is write a new narrative. Our current dominant narrative is extractive of our planet and exploitative of our peoples. What does it look like to create a regenerative narrative that not only is effective and sustainable moving forward, but also heals the harm and injustices of the past? And the main ways that we look at doing that are with what we've called the 5 pillars of regenerative accounting. And those pillars basically come down to humane governance, rewriting our financial narratives, financial and economic narratives, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, our overall well-being, and also being in right relationship with our planet and our climate. So 5 pillars. And the things that we talk about really weave those together. It's very seldom that we'll be talking exclusively about a single pillar, because you start talking about Jedi training, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And next thing we know, we're talking about equitable pay. And what does it mean to have, people be able to show up in a system of governance and a system of finance that is effective and equitable and includes belonging for everyone involved in those systems. So all of these weave together really well, not to mention the wellness and overall belonging of, hey, in order to feel wellness, belonging and human connection is one of those pieces. And our current systems have us thinking that in order to be effective in our working relationships, we have to put on some professional veneer where we're not allowed to show up in our full, true, authentic human selves, which is sometimes emotional and messy and needs support. What would it look like to have real human relationships with our colleagues, our coworkers, our clients, and be able to hold that space with and for each other? So all of those things kind of weave together. I'm going to toss it back to Matthew. Anything I missed there, Matthew? Are there any pillar ideas that are popping out in your mind?
No, not pillar ideas per se, but I think something that kind of comes up is like underscoring one of our values, right? Which is practical, like being practical about this work. And I say that because a lot of this stuff that we're talking about can seem like very distant or very far off, or in some cases very so large. It's like, okay, well, what does that have to do with me doing my job today? And I know that there are younger people listening to this who are either, choosing this career or at the beginning of their journey in this career, and listening to this content. And I'll tell you, like, from a very practical perspective, these are issues that I can't speak for Ingrid, but I can speak for myself. I am finding these issues as top priorities for my clients, right? And so literally, and what's challenging about and this is, I think, the fact that we're on the bleeding edge means that there's plenty of space on the bleeding edge for you to join us. So come on down, be a part of the AAN. We've got plenty of ways for people to get engaged, get involved, and make it super easy. But also, like, we need all the help we can get. And I say we in a general sense because, case in point, I have a client right now. I mentioned earlier, we're talking about this budgeting process and trying to make it equitable and figure out what it means for the organization. It's like, there are no clear, definitive, there are some, but there are no clear, definitive resources for some of the work and conversations that we're having. And we're having to piece together, like, okay, we've got some ideas over here and some ideas over here and some tools over here and some really cool YouTube videos we can watch over here and some books that we can read over here. And we're trying to piece together this conversation around what it means to have an equitable conversation around compensation and budgeting. And again, it's not to say that those things aren't out there, but we're finding ourselves in the position of having to piece together things. And so to me, it's particularly challenging because it's like there's no template, there's no playbook, there's no, oh yeah, it's like yeah, I've set up hundreds of QuickBooks files. There's a playbook for that. You just follow the instructions. Right, but there's not a playbook comparable to the instructions for setting up QuickBooks that there are for some of the conversations that we're having, and in part because they're nuanced conversations. And to Ingrid's point, this sort of like interdisciplinary approach is really important, because as the numbers person consulting this client, I have to understand first and foremost that not everybody has the same relationship to money, right? And knowing what that means from an equity perspective, when you then talk about compensation, it's like, no, there's nuances to saying, oh no, it's not everybody gets the same dollar amount, because that's not equitable, right? So, but understanding what that means, it means I have to become the advocate for some of these issues or these topics that would be considered outside of the scope of the traditional accountant. And so, I highlight that because I think that one of the things that we try to figure out at the Accounting Alchemy Network, and Ingrid, you did an exceptional job, I think, in collaboration with Jeanne Etienne around the justice, equity, diversity and inclusion conversations. We're trying to figure out, okay, yeah, these are really important topics and conversations, and they feel big, but how do we bring them down to what does that mean tomorrow when we show up in the office? What does that mean next week when we sit down in front of our client? And that's a huge part of this conversation that I think is a part of the work that we do.
I think that's so important, because one of the things I like about a lot of the people, in fact, it might almost be everybody in the Accounting Alchemy Network, is that everyone's working with smaller businesses or small businesses. It's not these huge things. And a lot of times when you hear these concepts, people think, oh, this is big business. This is something big company has. And I'm this little business, and what impact can I have? When in reality, they can have quite a large impact, especially given the number of small businesses. So if there's more of us, as I know both of you, as well as I am committed to working with small business or even small organizations, to include nonprofits and even government, there, that we can make this tidal wave of a movement through all of these little grassroots efforts.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Good, Ingrid, look, you're gonna jump in.
Oh, I was just gonna, I love bringing the idea of the small business in. A lot of the small business advisors and the small businesses themselves can be more agile. It takes a lot to turn the Titanic around and to make big change within a large organization. Whereas a small group of people can create that change more quickly and more effectively. And by creating that change within the smaller businesses, we develop the workflows and processes that then end up filtering upward into the larger companies once they've been tested and proven with the smaller companies. And so to a big extent, a lot of this is kind of the testing and proving ground for some of the education that Center for Accounting Transformation might be creating years down the line.
Completely. And that's why I appreciate you guys doing this groundbreaking work, because we do need to figure it out and then figure out how to scale. Because a lot of the nuanced conversations that Matthew's referencing, they're easier in a smaller organization, because I don't have to figure out how does this affect 100 people or 1,000 people? How does this affect the 3 or 4 people or 10 people that I'm working with? That's easier to get rid of some options and really think through, okay, who are these, and actually think of them as people rather than resources or numbers, right? These are people that we're dealing with, and how can I actually work through that?
Well, and I love, Donny, how you brought in the word holistic earlier. And if we think back even just a couple of decades, holistic medicine, that idea of holistic medicine has not been around in the mainstream for incredibly long. It's very recent that our insurance has started covering chiropractic and acupuncture and those kinds of treatments, and naturopathy and homeopathy. You know, there's a lot of different holistic medicine ideas out there that are becoming more mainstream. But just a couple of decades ago, they were new and unusual, and people were having to pay out of pocket. They were small businesses, and it doesn't take, over the grand scheme of things, that long to create change. So as we're introducing these ideas of regenerative accounting, holistic accounting into the accounting world, imagine just 10, 20 years from now, how much these ideas will have caught on and how people can show up in a more full expression of our personal values, ensuring that we don't have to sacrifice our deeply held values and beliefs on the altar of profit, because that's what the system has taught us that we need to do to survive. Our work in accounting and in business can be an expression of our values and beliefs.
Ooh, that is so powerful. The way that you brought holistic into that also makes me think a lot of the holistic medicine is really based off of the Asian Eastern medicine. And as we look at a lot of, I think, the changes even within regenerative accounting, within climate planet, as you've talked about, a lot of these, when you look at it, it comes back to the more community-based type of ecosystems that we saw, especially in, I'm going to call it ancient Asia, not rather than modern Asia, whether it's there or even both of you opened with recognizing the native lands that you were on, the Native American, me being from Hawaii, the Native Hawaiian. As I'm looking at a lot of what we're working with, I often go back and go, wow, the Native Hawaiians, because that's my reference point, they really knew a lot. And what we're doing is really readopting a lot of these First Peoples type of thinking that, again, it's not the settler colonialist, well, I'm running out of resources in my area, so I'm going to go get it from somewhere else and take it back to my place.
Yeah. Well, and I guess I don't know if you want to go down this road, but I'm going to take it there if you're okay with it, Donny. You're spot on, right? And I think there's something to be said about honoring, there is something explicitly to be said about honoring indigenous traditions, right? In part because what those traditional, I can't speak for all of them, but what a lot of them tend to be about is being connected to earth and being connected to nature and understanding your relationship to the environment around you. And I think that's a very distinct mindset that's not, I think, what sort of the capitalist kind of American culture has been about, which is very much, you know, going in someplace, taking resources, extracting stuff, and then getting out, right? And I think it kind of brings me back to this question of, like, we've used this term regenerative a couple of times, but I don't think we've, you know, taken the time to really define it and explain what it is. And so I'll kind of share my 2 cents on that, and then ask Ingrid to do the same. But I remember when we first started these conversations, and I remember back to my earlier years in the profession, and certainly when I was advising other companies more aggressively, it was all about growth, right? It's like, how can we increase the revenue? How can we bring in more business? And then how can we manage our expenses to optimize our profit, right? And that was sort of, that was the focus. That was the reason for existence and being in business, right? And then it shifted for me over time. But then what kind of became the new trend was sustainability, right? It's like, okay, no, we're not gonna just be driven by profit, but we're gonna be driven by sustainability. Well, what does that really mean, right? And then all of a sudden this conversation comes up about, okay, well, how do we not just think about tomorrow's bank account, but how do we think about next year and the following year, and really creating some consistency around maintaining our growth. And again, there was sort of an emphasis on growth, but it was about sustaining the growth. Well, then along came Ingrid, and she sort of introduced me to a bunch of other things. And one of those things was this concept of regenerative. And first of all, 2 things come to mind when I think about this concept of regenerative. One is this idea of death, actually, and more explicitly realizing that a lot of the systems that we've had in place actually don't need to be here anymore, right? And so we can like anything in life, you sort of adopt a new metaphor. You think about the world that we live in, or the businesses that we create as natural ecosystems. Birth and death go hand in hand, right? And so what systems do we have in place in our culture today that might have helped us to get to where we're at, but aren't going to help us get to where we're going? We need to let those go. But then as far as the regenerative piece comes into the play, I kind of think of it as like the opposite of that in a way. It's sort of, those are the things that we can do that are life affirming, right? And that is actually a win-win-win for everyone, right? And so that's another concept that is important to the AAN, is this idea of a win-win-win, right? Because in the old model, it was I win, you lose, right? Or I win, you win, they lose. There was always a loser, right? And there is in the game of limited resources, you know, there's like, oh, I got 10, you got 0, you get 1, I got 9, right? Like that sort of mechanism is there. But in the regenerative approach, where there's a win-win-win relationship, yes, you are thinking about yourself. You're also thinking about your neighbor. You're thinking about your work colleagues. You're thinking about your clients. But then you're also thinking about the communities that are impacted by the clients that you serve. You're thinking about the place where you choose to operate your business, right? And am I choosing to contribute to to the problem with greenhouse gases? Am I asking everybody to drive and go 50? I mean, you're actually thinking about the impact of your work beyond, oh, how did we do with our margins this month, right? It's not just about, so the regenerative piece for me is really taking that bird's eye view and thinking about how it's like you drop a stone in the water, right? It's like it has a ripple in all directions. And so we're actually consciously saying like, oh, we now know that, let's be very intentional where we drop the stone, because not only is it going to go down and to the bottom of the water or whatever, but it's also going to have this ripple effect. What is that ripple effect? And is that ripple effect going to support the world, or the world that's impacted by it, or is it going to cause harm, right? And that's the mindfulness, I think, that comes with being a regenerative accounting professional. Ingrid, what say you, Ingrid?
I love everything you just said, Matthew. I mean, what you're describing to me is kind of the paradigm shift from what we've been calling the power over paradigm, this zero-sum game where in order to win, somebody else has to lose. That involves power dynamics and needing to have control, and that's built on those systems of institutional and systemic racism, colonialism, capitalism we've been describing, to transitioning to what we like to call the power with paradigm, which is a positive sum game where everyone can win. And it is focused on how can we empower each other, each of us, to be in the full highest self, where we can show up in an expression of ourselves that brings us joy and fulfillment, where we can be in right relationship with all peoples and our planet, and make sure that we are doing work and creating things that are life affirming rather than extracting and exploiting. And it's fascinating to me. I was just this morning got to partake of a webinar put on by an organization, I think called Rethinking Economics. And the discussion was around, what comes after GDP? Has GDP seen its day? This idea of the gross domestic product being the thing that we measure as our sign of economic success. Well, gross domestic product will be higher, giving a false sense of success during wartime. And hey, our broken healthcare systems, particularly here in the United States, are extremely profitable. So when it comes down to it, the current systems are measuring the wrong things. We are accounting for things and using as measurements of success, things that are encouraging us to cause harm in our world. So the question becomes, what else can we measure? How can accountants become the people in our world who are holding humanity accountable for the things that we want to account for, which needs to be our values and beliefs? That is how we are going to make the change that we want to see in the world, is we need to come up with better key performance indicators for success, better metrics, better measurements. And that is what we are working on, is developing what is it that needs to be measured? What story do we want to tell? Because it all comes down to the narrative. Lynn Twist talks about how we don't live in the world, we live in the story that we tell ourselves about the world. So what would it look like to create a new narrative, and recognizing that accounting professionals are storytellers? We look at the data and we present the data as a narrative. And how often do we actually ask the business owner, what story do they want to tell? Are they telling the story about their kid in college and they're trying to pull together these kinds of goals in their personal lives? And how much is enough? Because if we're operating on these toxic myths that Lynn Twist talks about in her book, The Soul of Money, she talks about this idea that there's not enough. There's just not enough to go around. Toxic myth number one, that more is better. So the more we can get, the better off we'll be, even if, we have plenty and somebody else doesn't have. And that's just the way it is. So we don't need to question it. When we start questioning those toxic myths and realize there's actually plenty to go around, that many of us are living beyond our sufficient needs, we can start reframing these ideas and start looking at what would it look like to live in right relationship? What are our actual needs? What does it look like to go about things in a different way? What would it look like to actually take a look at the carbon footprint of our entire supply chain? Accountants can help measure things like that. What would it look like to account for more than just money? And even within our financial decisions, how do we make our financial choices an expression of our values, rather than something that we feel like we need to just accumulate more on the bottom line and earn and pay interest, when interest is causing harm on the other side of that equation?
You're bringing in some really important concepts. Coming back to, I think, the role of accountants, which I don't think a lot of, especially students, don't realize because they see accounting and they think it's all about money, when really we're about counting. That's the accountant. It's counting, and it's about applying standards around counting, which tells us how we account for financials. But now we've got other things like ESG reporting that has different standards that tell us how we account for carbon and other types of things. So I think that's an important one for students to realize, is that accounting is not just about money. And the other one that I think you've mentioned, Matthew's actually mentioned it several times. Actually, in all of what Matthew's doing, he's doing a lot of decision support, which is the other thing that I think we help a lot of people do, is making these decisions that are analyzing all of the different nuances, and they're not all money, but really kind of understanding what's the greater impact, whether it's internally creating an equitable or inequitable environment based on the decision. What are the external factors that are coming in? How do I pull that in? What is the impact on the community, to the environment? How does that factor into a lot of decision making? And that's something, we're not the decision maker, but we're the ones often gathering all the information. Like Matthew mentioned, there's all these sources. You got to go to all these sources, pull the information, and then you're giving it back to the client to say, hey, this is the information I've gathered for you. What would you like to do? And I think of that as the influence. Our influence role is our role. Part of our role is to influence the client, whether it's an internal client, like I'm a CFO or controller, and it's my business owner, my president or CEO, or an external accountant that is saying, hey, by the way, you should also think about this aspect, which is the ethical aspect, which I don't think we've used that word yet, but a lot of the other words, humane, justice, equity, all of these point back towards ethics. And what is the ethical decision that needs to be made? And we're often that ethical voice in the room as well.
Yeah. Well, and Donny, I'll just kind of highlight something that you said that I think is really important. And I might paraphrase it, but in essence, I think what you're suggesting too and highlighting is the not only the influence but the power we have, right? And I think the reason why my entry into the accounting profession was very backdoor, right? I came in through the arts nonprofit sector, and then from the arts nonprofit sector, I moved into the workforce development, still nonprofit sector. And then in the workforce development space, that's when I got interested and educated in what accounting and bookkeeping was. And that's a long story, I won't get into it. But the long story short is what I realized at a very early stage when I was doing workforce development and job training, teaching low-income and unemployed people how to enter into the workforce as bookkeepers and accounting professionals, was the reason why it was so interesting for me, and the motivation for me was I got to create jobs, right, for people who would then go work at companies and make sure that those companies could stay running and create more jobs for other people, right? And so, okay, there's a very clear ability that we have to, quote, keep the doors open, right, for businesses. We're literally the ones that are like, okay, this week, here's what's coming up for you. And next week, here's what's going to go down. And if you don't address this issue or that issue, you realize the financial implications of that are going to be this. And so we actually have that power, right, to have those conversations. And a lot of people don't, right? So don't take it for granted that you can talk in numbers with people, but then also with what do they say? With great power comes great responsibility, right? And so therefore, clients are going to come to you as the accountant and say, I'm worried about keeping our doors open. I'm worried about serving our customers. I'm worried about whether or not this product is going to, we can even afford to get into the market. And they're going to look at you and scratch their heads and say, help, right? And that's exactly to Ingrid's point, where you have the ability to come in and to your point, Donny, too, say, okay, yes, we're going to figure this out, but we're going to figure it out from a place grounded in our values with a strong sense of integrity around our ethics, right? And we're going to move for ourselves and for our community and for everybody that we're going to touch. And that's exactly the kind of an accountant that I think people are going to want more of as this industry continues to evolve.
Well, and Matthew, I just want to highlight that you just quoted Marvel Comics while wearing a Japanese animation t-shirt. And like, Like, this is the kind of superhero accounting that Donny's been working to be like, hey, we can be the change we want to see in the world. What kind of superhero do you want to be? Let's bring our passion to the accounting profession. That the accounting profession does not have to be this soulless, lifeless, kind of dead thing that just perpetuates an unsustainable status quo. We get to change it by simply showing up in our full selves, bringing our passion, and creating the change we want to see in the world. And that makes us superheroes. That accounting is a skill that can be applied in many, many ways. It is a tool. It's a Swiss Army knife. It can be applied in so many ways. And you get to decide how you want to apply that skill to create the change that you want to see in the world. It's up to each of us to decide.
That is such a powerful statement. I think we should wrap there. If people want to learn more about the Accounting Alchemy Network, where can they find more information?
Go to accountingalchemy.net and you can sign up for our newsletter from there. It will direct you to our LinkedIn and Facebook groups. Currently, the entire thing is non-monetized. So we are demonstrating how we can make a positive change in the world without it having to cost a bunch of money. All of you are welcome to come join the conversation. If it gives you a security notice at the web pages, because currently it's a free MailChimp splash page site. So make sure not to put the S at the end of the HTTP. Eventually we'll have a real web page. But for right now, we're going the free and cheap, hey, grassroots movement route, and it's working. So.
And if they want to get in touch with you, Ingrid, how can they find you?
You are welcome to email me at ingrid@priestessofprofits.com.
Thank you. And Matthew, if they want to get in touch with you?
Yes, it's Matthew, Mathew. That's Matthew with 1 T at 10kcreators.com. 10, the letter K, creators.com.
Well, thank you both. I always know I'm going to enjoy talking with you guys, but I feel like we hit some more interesting aspects and words and the interplay of all of it. And we brought in a bunch of history too, believe it or not, as we look at it. So thank you for the holistic conversation. And to all of you out there, I'll see you on the next Accounting Art podcast.
Thank you.
The Center for Accounting Transformation provides business professionals with a network for utilizing innovations that are ready for adoption, the training and resources necessary to apply those innovations, and an opportunity to engage the talent and community needed to further the pursuit of innovative accounting practices that drive responsible and mindful business performance. Find out more at our website, www.improvetheworld.net. And if you're interested in sharing your own transformation stories, please contact us there.